just a minute or so's background, but I've had an interest in photography since the early 80s. My first camera back then was, a Pentax ME Super. Anybody remember Pentax ME Super? And I actually stuck with the brand for a very long time. That interest kind of waxed and waned over the years until 2006, when I bought my first digital SLR, thought I'm going to take it a bit more seriously this time, went along to Guildford. I live in the middle of Guildford, so it was a logical place to go, Guildford Photographic Society, where I've been ever since. Over the years, I've been chairman, competition secretary, program secretary, been around most of the jobs there. Got my LRPS in about 2012. I'm now just finishing my 4th season as a judge in the Surrey Photographic Association. My own photography, probably landscape, particularly monochrome landscape, appropriately enough for tonight. But I'm also a keen birder, and I have been doing quite a lot of bird photography. And if anybody's remotely curious, the virtual background I've got, which you will note is not a monochrome shot, is a peregrine at Chichester Harbour. So why do we still shoot monochrome? This is a presentation I've now made to probably 8 or 9 clubs around the Surrey, Sussex, Hants area, and it normally fills an evening. So in other words, it's probably about an hour and 40 minutes. Now, talking to Ian, we both felt people tend to suffer from Zoom fatigue after an hour or so, so it made better sense to split it in 2, and I'll explain now what that's going to look like. We're going to cover the first 3 parts, which are, if you like, a fairly conventional PowerPointy presentation now. And then in a week's time, same time next week, I'm hoping I'm going to persuade some of you to send me some colour photographs. And during the course of the evening next week, I'm actually going to work on them live, as it were. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this presentation. So we're going to look at why monochrome now, why does it still exist, what works in monochrome, and a little bit on how to produce good monochrome. So why monochrome now? Just a little bit of history to kick off. Photography was monochrome from when it was invented. 1839, generally accepted as the birth of photography, but what happened is 2 people in 2 different countries were coming up with photography in rather different technical ways, pretty much simultaneously. So you can have a little bit of an argument about who got there first. 2 different processes, but they were both mono. They could be heavily toned with a single colour, so not exactly black and white, you know, things like sepia and so forth, popular from early days. As early as 1848, there were examples of colour photography, but they needed exposures of hours or days. So for the kind of studio shot, of a head and shoulders shot, it wasn't really practicable because people just couldn't sit still for long enough. Autochrome, commercially launched 1907, that took 3 images. You might remember from when you were kids having little stereoscope things where you looked through 2 eyes, had different colors, and it produced a kind of 3D image with different colors. I think it was a similar sort of thing. So you then had to view it through a mosaic. Now, Kodachrome, which is a name which will be familiar to almost everybody here, I should think, actually became available in 1935. Now, that was practical, though slow, process for transparencies, and that started the color revolution. Now, I mentioned my own interest dates from the early 80s, and I used to take slide film, and I used Kodachrome quite a bit. And my memory is there were 2 speeds you could get, 25 ASA, as we called it back then, ISO as we now would, and 64. I think it was 25 and 64. Fine for landscapes, not a lot of use if you wanted to take pictures of birds in flight, because the shutter speeds you were going to end up with would be hopelessly long. In 1942, Kodacolor provided negatives for making prints, but 35mm color negative film wasn't actually available until 1958. And yet most serious professionals continued to shoot in black and white. And I'm now going to show you some kind of iconic photographers and photographs, mainly of the 20th century, just to give an idea of the sort of photographs people were producing. A couple of classic Ansel Adams, monolith, face of half dome. And I'm talking quite fast, but I'm very happy to take questions. And a totally different sort of Ansel Adams shot, this one, with that rather beautiful aspen in the foreground, light coloured foreground aspen. Another great name. I've always wondered what those guys are actually doing, but anyway, Cartier-Bresson. And I think if you wanted a picture to demonstrate Cartier-Bresson, famous for the expression, the decisive moment, this, I think, demonstrates it really well, because if that picture had been taken a fifth of a second earlier or later, that bite would not have been precisely where it was. And remember, we're not talking about an era where you could just set your shutter to take 20 frames or even 60 frames using a modern Olympus a second. Taking a photograph was a performance. So I think Cartier-Bresson got that one about right. Iconic picture, very controversial picture, because there are suggestions this was set up, but this was taken by Robert Capa during the Spanish Civil War, Spain 1936. We don't know for sure whether it was a setup or whether this guy is actually dying, but he probably is. And one of my favourite photographers, Edward Weston, and a whole series of pepper pictures. And I think this manages to be sensual and sensuous all at the same time. And if you look, does that not look like the back and the spine of a human, probably a female human, with two hands? I know the hands don't look perfect, but I just think it's an incredible picture. What Weston's achieved here with lighting, pretty amazing, I think.
I think it looks like a boxer, actually, Paul.
You think it looks like a boxer, Ronnie?
Boxing gloves.
Yeah, yes, except to me that back looks very feminine. Well, I suppose these days it could certainly be a female boxer.
Never get past the EU vegetable rules.
Anyway, right, another iconic picture. This picture had enormous impact. It was taken during a period of depression in the States, where there were a lot of people who had absolutely nothing. And Dorothea Lange found this woman, the kids. Yes, there was a degree of pose involved in putting it together, but it had, as photography can have, a huge social impact. Coming much more up to date. Sorry, did somebody? No? I thought I had a. This one, a great photographer of today, I think, Sebastião Salgado. I'm not sure, I may replace this picture because I think there are others that work better. And this looks like he's used the sunlight filter in a modern piece of software. And actually he hasn't, and this is a genuine picture, but he's someone who's stuck with black and white and film indeed. And a name that some of you will know, maybe not quite as famous as most of the photographers I've shown so far, but I'm guessing some of you will be aware of Paul Gallagher and his company Aspect 2i, workshop company. Paul, I think, is an outstandingly good monochrome photographer, and I think this picture just shows quite the range of tones that he's captured here and the shapes and so forth. I like this picture quite a lot. I may come back to Paul Gallagher because there's something that he's told me that's influenced my own conversions to mono. Anyway.
Actually, I'll just make a quick comment. This is the first time I've mentioned it, but in talking about mono and landscapes, Steve Gosling is the target for our next presentation. So we just need final confirmation.
That's terrific news, Ian, because he's a super photographer and Olympus through and through, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good news. Okay, so many professionals were reluctant to switch to colour. Why was that? They didn't like it. They found that monochrome gave them creative options that colour didn't. Or maybe they were just stick in the muds who preferred to stick to what they knew. But whatever the reason, monochrome has continued to be an important aspect of modern photography. There was someone on the forum today who posted that they thought black and white was irrelevant because if colour photography had been invented first, no one would ever have bothered with black and white. I don't have a firm answer to that, but I'm going to come back to that question in a few slides' time, I think. So what's the perspective now? Well, pre-digital, you had to decide what film to use. You were using either black and white, almost certainly print, color slide, or color print. Now you can make that decision long after the event, years after the event. But most modern cameras can actually be set up with live view showing a mono view, maybe even with toning. And I think, Ollie, I've never actually tried playing with the toning things, but I think you can tone your screen with mono, with sepia or whatever. Anyone able to confirm that? No, no one else has played with it either. Okay. Quick word about toning. The definition of monochrome, including most competitions, is one color plus black or white. Now, I've now judged a few monochrome competitions, but I had an unfortunate experience a couple of years ago at one club where I thought I was judging a monochrome competition, and about halfway through the first half, up came a picture which had rather a lot of bright orange in it. It wasn't sort of subtle sepia or selenium, it was bright orange. And I was very uncomfortable with it. Fortunately, maybe it wasn't that great a picture and I didn't give it a very good mark and we moved on very quickly. But at the interval, the competition secretary said, oh, you should just have disqualified that. This is a black and white competition. There's a trophy for it. And the guy who put up the trophy said, I want it to be black and white. Well, it occurred to me afterwards, in that case, why did the competition secretary actually allow the picture in the first place? Because it clearly didn't meet the criteria. That's unusual. Most competitions do allow you to use a tone, one tone. Traditionally, it might be sepia or selenium, but there are lots of creative possibilities. If you're a keen phone photographer, there are all sorts of apps around which apply creative mono instantly to phone pictures. So why are we still producing mono? There's something about historic continuity. Maybe it's similar to the fact some people still prefer LPs to digital sound. It adds timelessness to a shot, can convey a sense of a particular period. You can convey a sense of the 1950s or 60s, say, or even earlier, by making a shot black and white. But also very often the elimination of color reduces distractions. You may have your main feature of your photo in the foreground, but in the rear, there's some brightly colored dressed people, whatever it might be, and are inevitably going to take the eye away from what you're trying to show them. And by doing it in monochrome, you can reduce that distraction. And it allows tones, it allows shapes to take precedence. Black and white is a distortion. It's a distortion of the truth because that's not how we see things. So we can play with the truth much more than you can with color. It's too green is an example I'm giving you because if you see a color picture where the greens are overcooked, it just looks artificial instantly. And well, we're a group of Olympus users, so I can use the example of Fuji green, Velvia green, those sorts of things can very easily go over the top. By converting to black and white, you can get away with putting a lot more drama into a picture without it actually distorting the truth. There's another point. We've all heard of golden hours and doing all your photography at dawn and dusk and so forth. And for color photography, that can be the case. But actually, light, which is very dull for color, can be just fine for mono. So we're less limited if you're taking mono pictures to dawn and dusk. And it does enable you to concentrate on the amount and the quality of the light around you. Right, so what works in monochrome? Generally anything where shape, contrast, tone and texture are the major factors. Anything where color distracts from the message you're trying to get across. Long exposure landscapes, something I quite enjoy doing, and I think there might be one or two examples coming up. You can do them in color, but for some reason they tend to work much better in mono. And portrait photography particularly, I know this is a sexist comment these days, but wizened old men where there are lots of lines in the faces, you can really draw those lines out in a black and white picture to a degree which would look artificial in color. Street photography. I think that's a traditional classic to do in mono. Again, doesn't have to be, but it works well. Reportage, and I think this perhaps dates back to when newspaper photographers would all be shooting black and white. Flowers can work. It's an odd thing. Try this. A solitary flower, a rose, whatever it might be, works really well in black and white, whereas a bunch of flowers doesn't necessarily. I can't explain that one, but I do believe it's true. And infrared photography, I don't know. Is there anybody here who has converted a camera to infrared? To unmute your mic or do something. Yeah,
I have.
Yeah. We actually took, it happens to have been our first Micro Four Thirds camera, and I'm afraid it was a Panasonic, but we actually converted that to infrared, and we did it in ways which would enable us to do all sorts of fancy false colour. It's a bit of a one-trick pony, false colour in infrared. It's quite fun for a day or two, and then it just looks silly, whereas black and white infrared can look absolutely superb. So that's something that works really well in mono. And if I can just throw in, as I am a judge's perspective on all this, the first question I ask myself when I see a picture come up in mono is, why has the photographer chosen to process this in mono? And I hope the answer is a little bit more than, well, this is a mono competition. But in fact, in general, open competitions, you do normally see quite a few monochrome pictures. Second question, how well have they processed it? And of course, the third question, you might argue this should be the first question, is how good's the image anyway? I think there's another judge watching me, at least one other judge watching me. Is it Graham? Do you wish to comment? No?
Paul?
Sorry.
Can I just say that when I very rarely do mono, but what I find very, very good in mono is if I've been on a safari and I have pictures of elephants, particularly if it's a sunny day, you can get rid of all that brightness and the mono gets the texture of the elephant absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
And I find that's when I really like to do mono.
I have to say that mono is a great place to go when your picture doesn't work in color. It seems to me that if you can't get it, if it's too noisy, if it's the contrast isn't right, if the color balance isn't right, you can make a great image. You can save an image by making it mono.
Yeah, which partly comes back to my point about you can actually take quite good landscape pictures even at midday. It's not, you know, there are other reasons why it's not the ideal light, but you've got a much better chance of getting something usable out of it, I think, if you convert to mono. Okay, we're now going to see some of mine. I've kept them well separated from the likes of Ansel Adams and Henri Cartier-Bresson, but I thought you'd want to see something of what I'm talking about. This is a picture called The Haunted House. It's some years old now, and there are a couple of things I'd do differently if I was processing it now. One is I think I've overcooked the sky a bit, to be honest. The sky needs to be dramatic and interesting, but it looks maybe a little overdone. It's also a little bit noisy. I've just treated myself to Topaz Denoise AI, I think it's called. And I did so partly because Andy Rouse, in his presentation to this group not so long back, said it works really well with Olympus. And I think a number of other members of this group are keen on it as well. Anyway, I didn't have it when I produced this. The other thing I think I would try, you see the white bits on the, I can't point, one minute. Can I bring up? No, I haven't even got a mouse. What do you call those safety loop? I've forgotten the name of them. Under the house, there is stuck on the wall.
Life rings.
Yeah, that's it. Life rings. Stuck on the wall there, and the white of that I think is a little. I'd love to get rid of that. I think I'd clone the whole thing out, or I just darken those considerably. But having said that, I do think with my title of The Haunted House, there is something of that atmosphere about the picture. I think it works from that point of view, even if maybe I overdid some elements. This is West Wittering down on the south coast. It's not a long exposure, although I've done quite a bit of long exposure work there. But I think the reason I've included it is because I think it just shows you how silhouettes can be really effective in mono as well. And this is the first of a number of examples you're going to see of the fact that I really like trying to bring drama out of the sky. And so what you have here is a dramatic sky. This is Winchelsea. And you can see it's chucking it down over in the distance, and it's going to be chucking it down where I am within a few minutes. And I've just, in mono to a degree which I don't think I could have done in colour, brought out the drama in that sky and the reflection of it, I think, in the sand as well. Another one from West Wittering. I've only included this because I quite like the clouds and I quite like the shape the clouds are making, but no masterpiece. Now this one, Ronnie and David may remember it because this actually won our landscape competition a few years ago. It's also Winchelsea, and amongst the figures the rather Lowry-like figures you can see on there, there are a number of other photographers if you look closely. But again, what I've been able to do, there's weather coming in. I've tried to bring out the drama in that weather, and I don't think, I mean, probably was a pretty monochromatic scene by this time anyway. I don't think you could have achieved that in colour. Same occasion, but now it's much more obvious. There are other photographers from Guildford actually there. I haven't done quite the level of drama in the sky on this one, and I can quite believe some of you may prefer that. This is, what's the big loch in the middle of Scotland? Oh God, brains.
Loch Ness?
No, not Loch Ness.
Loch Lomond.
Loch Lomond, thank you. Loch Lomond. Right, we're standing one side of Loch Lomond, and once again, the weather is coming in on the other side of Loch Lomond, and I hope you can see the drama and the rain coming out of that cloud. Now, if I was being picky here, I've allowed the tree on the left to get too near the edge of the photo. But, you know, I think some of that drama is coming across.
I like that, nice.
Sorry, who was that?
That was me.
Hi, David. This is an infrared. This was actually taken by my wife, who spends much more time actually with the infrared than I do for some reason. But it just gives you an idea, if you haven't spent much time with infrared, how you can bring drama out of trees, blacken skies, whiten grasses and foregrounds. And I think it's just a fairly simple, fairly dramatic shot.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
Converting cameras to infrared, any mirrorless work?
Pretty much, and in fact, mirrorless tend to work better than traditional SLRs. So if you've got an older generation Pani or Olympus that you're no longer really using, it's sitting in a cupboard, it just might be worth thinking of doing it. It does cost a couple of £100, but it gives you a new camera and a new branch of photography to try. There are, I think, 2 firms. I'm only aware of 2 firms in England in Britain that do it, but I'm sure if you just Google convert camera to infrared, they'll come up.
I have to say that I had an infrared converted EPL1, which I still have, which is a fine camera for infrared, and I put it up on the hire service when the hire service was running, and not one person hired it.
I don't know what to say. It would have been a good idea for people to hire it just to get a feel for what they could do with infrared. Anyway, this is not a presentation about infrared. This is the one and only. Right, the next 2 photographs I do just want to spend a minute or 2 on. One of the things you're suffering from as an audience this evening is normally when I do this talk, I turn up with 9 or 10 prints. And as a slide I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes makes clear, I do think the print is the ultimate final form of a monochrome photograph. And of course, I can't show you the prints. So what I do, though, is show these 2 slides. They're both, some of you may recognize this tree at Buttermere. I have to tell you, they were taken about 3 years apart, these two pictures. We're going to call this one subtle and this one dramatic. Ian, I should have given you forewarning of this. How quickly can we get a vote running? Is it a practical thing to do? Can't, you're muted, Ian.
You can do thumbs up, can't you?
Thumbs up.
We can do thumbs up. All right.
Well,
Does everybody...
I can add a question. So
Yeah.
Go on. What do you want to ask?
Well, I want to know whether people prefer subtle or dramatic. Same tree, 3 years apart, different treatment.
Okay.
What I can't show you is the paper I'd have printed them on, but...
Okay, I have to say, this is the first time I've used it. It looks incredibly complex, so I think we'll just go...
Oh, don't worry, it's not that important. Yeah. But I'll tell you why I do this thing, though. What I do is, in the first half, I show you the projected digital images, and you get a vote, and the vote may go one way or the other. It might well go in favour of this more dramatic one. Then during the interval, people go up and look at the print stands where I've got the two prints, which are done on different papers and different ways. And a lot of people then like the subtler one much more. And it's much harder to show that without actually being able to show you the prints. But does anybody want to comment, even if we can't do a proper vote, on, you know, whether you prefer subtle or dramatic?
Well, I've thumbs up the subtle. Subtle for me. All the way.
So
on the chat, Paul, there's about 50-50, to be honest.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me hugely. But what would have been interesting is if you'd then been able to go and have a look at the prints, because there would be people who changed their minds. Always happens. And it's to do with how I've printed it and the paper I've printed it on and stuff like that. Anyway, I can't demonstrate that. But
definitely a screen is not going to convey what you can see on a print, because as Danny Chow said a few days ago, what you're seeing on the screen is emissive. The blacks are never going to be totally black, no matter how good your screen is. And with a print, it's reflective, and you can get really, really deep blacks on a print.
Yeah, all very fair points.
A comment, Paul?
Yep, sure.
Hi, everyone. For me, the aspect ratio makes the dramatic one a lot more appealing, as well as the fact I prefer, I think history will tell you, I prefer the dramatic type image. But yeah, the aspect ratio is different and the crop's different.
Yeah, I mean, it's not square, but it's heading towards square, and that's much taller and thinner. Yeah. Yeah, it's a fair point.
Can I just add my tuppence halfpenny there? I think that the dramatic one takes away from the shape of the top of the tree, whereas the subtle, the top of the tree actually stands out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, good point.
I was just looking at them and thinking, if you look at the subtle one and you imagine that printed on a matte paper or even a watercolor paper,
yeah,
that would look so much more interesting. I think with the other one, you brought with a gloss picture, you get a really good picture. But I think the subtle one would give you an awful lot more printed on something like aquarelle or something like that.
Well, yeah, I'm very glad you said that, Jim, because when I do show the prints, that's exactly what I've done. I've done the subtle one on a much matter, slightly textured paper, and it does bring out the qualities of it, I think. Okay. Fairly conventional long exposure, I suppose. Everybody know what a JCB is? Because I've got a couple of them in the foreground. Joe Cornish boulders. I'm not claiming this is anything like as good as a Joe Cornish, but it's a fairly conventional shot in that you've got movement in the clouds and a smoothing of the water. And I may well have had a polarizer on as well, judging by how clear the water is in the foreground.
Do you mind me saying there's a bit of glowing going on around the boulder on the right-hand side? Is that a fair comment?
I'm not really.
Awesome.
Oh yes, on the right-hand side of it. Yeah, I think you're right, Ian. God, how many times have I shown that picture without noticing it?
Sorry.
Yeah, well, it's not a masterpiece anyway, but you're right. And oh, this is one, always had a soft spot for this one, but the judge, when I put it in for a competition, did not have. He quite liked the mountains and clouds in the background, and he quite liked the boat in the foreground, but thought the middle of it was a bit dull and boring. And it's made me wish I'd bobbed down, which would have enabled me to reduce the amount of water in the middle of the shot. I still actually quite like the composition of this, but it hasn't proved universally popular.
It's nice though, because it splits into thirds.
Sorry?
It splits into thirds, doesn't it, really?
Well, I
Not
suppose you
quite
could argue
thirds,
it's quarters, because you've got the boat quarter, then you've got the water, then you've got the mountains, then you've got the clouds. So,
I suppose, yeah.
yeah.
I like it.
I like it.
Thank you. The only reason I've included this one, apart from the fact, I don't know, it looks to me like a bit of a 1950s, 1960s postcard. I really like that cloud. I enjoy that cloud, which looks a bit like a fish or something, or maybe you could argue it mirrors what's in the foreground. I don't know. But otherwise, it's an old-fashioned, conventional sort of landscape photo, I think. I didn't mention architecture as being something that suits mono, but it really does. This is the Titanic building in Belfast, taken with a wide-angle lens. And just to show you what an idiot I could be, I had talked myself into this being a long exposure, because if you look at the sky, it does look a bit like a long exposure sky. But as someone has pointed out, there are figures standing in the doorway who are clearly not moving, so it must have been a normal length exposure. But anyway, the point is, I think it works quite well in mono. I've only included this not terribly interesting photograph. If anyone ever asks you what a lead-in line looks like, here's your answer. The whole photograph is basically a leading line. And back to Northern Ireland, this is Ballycastle. It's only about 7 miles from the Scottish coast. And we were staying in a B&B, and we'd retreated because of the weather into our room, and I actually took this out of the window of our B&B, and it's that same theme which you've gathered by now I quite like, of dramatic skies with rain coming out of them. But it's another one, you know, you may like this style, you may not, but it's another one I quite enjoy. And I think this is the last of my photographs you've got to sit through, and this is quite recent. This is last September, 40th wedding anniversary trip to Argentina, and this is actually taken from the Argentina side of the Iguazu Falls over towards the Brazil side. And what's slightly unusual about it is I had the Olympus 300mm lens on my camera, because I was mainly doing bird photography, because there were loads of really interesting tropical birds. And the falls were fortunately a long way away. And despite the fact I was using a lens which one wouldn't normally use for landscape, I got this shot, and I'm quite pleased with it. And again, by doing it in mono, what I've been able to do is just bring the whites out of the waterfall, the lower part of the waterfall, a bit more than one could otherwise have done. Okay. Moving swiftly.
I noticed, Paul, you've got just a little bit of the required water droplets on from Iguazu there at the very top, by the look of it.
No, those actually, there are trees on the far side.
Oh, are they?
But yeah, I'm not sure they are water droplets actually.
Well, everything I took there has got water droplets
on it. Yeah, yeah, it's a fabulous spot. Right, final part for today. Right, how can you go about producing monochrome from a color original? I'm assuming everybody's shooting digital. We should all be Olympus users. There might be 1 or 2 exceptions, and who knows, somebody might be using an old OM1 or OM2 or something. But 99% of the time you're going to be shooting in digital, I would think. So what can you do? You can just desaturate. I wouldn't recommend that. It produces a very dull result. You can use Lightroom's auto black and white mixer. And I've made an assumption that people are familiar with Lightroom. My experience going around camera clubs is somewhere between 60% and 2/3 are normally using Lightroom. I have no idea whether that's true here, but if you're using some other form of post-processing software, it's probably got some means of converting to black and white, which will be similar. Anyway,
do you mean when you're using Lightroom, using the color channels in black and white?
Well, the automatic bit, the Lightroom will take a guess at how to do the conversion. It hasn't got a clue how to do it, but it's the starting point. Then you start using the color sliders, and this is what I will be demonstrating next week.
Yeah, that's one aspect of using Lightroom that I find brilliant. It really does make producing a customized black and white look very, very easy.
Yeah.
Can I add a comment, Ian?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Thanks for letting me mention. Another good thing, Paul, you might want to include or have a look at if you haven't, is the white balance adjustment in Lightroom when you're converting black and white images, particularly if you want more contrast without going, without adding to the clarity or the contrast slider. It provides some wonderful additional effects. If you put it back to color, it looks terrible, but then...
Yeah, no, John, you're quite right. And I will make a note that at least one of the things I demonstrate next week, I will play with the color balance. I mean, I know it does make quite a big difference.
General message: if you change the color, you'll change the black and white, and you can be very creative by changing the color to produce amazing black and white. Yeah, John's absolutely right.
Yeah, agree.
Can I make a comment here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't use Lightroom. I use Darktable, and I've looked at sort of various tutorials, and the best way it seems in Darktable is to use the channel mixers. But also, what I've done before actually doing the conversion is to sample on a color that I perhaps want to mute. So I use the color lookup table, sample of the color I want to mute, bring that down before converting to black and white in the channel mixer, and then play with the colors to get the effect I want. And that seems to work very well. That sounds similar to what you're talking about in either the white balance messing about or a black and white mixer of some sort.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with your software, John, so I can't really comment on that. But I think any modern piece of software is going to have something that enables you to decide whether you want the reds to be lighter or darker, the blues to be lighter, and so on and so forth. And that's what we'll be playing with next week.
Can I also mention that there are dedicated digital cameras for mono, Leica's monochrome range, for example. And I have had some quite spirited discussions with some of my journalist colleagues who think that the Leica monochrome is the bee's knees. I could describe it in a different way, but this is a family audience. And I still think that you can produce a better result using a color image to start with, because you're stuck with Leica's basic premise on what a black and white image should look like. I think it's harder work to get to convert color to black and white, but I think ultimately you can get a better result. That's my own opinion, anyway.
And I agree with you 100%, Ian. My understanding is that the optical quality produced by that Leica camera is very good indeed. However, you lose all the creativity, all the ability to mess about with it afterwards and do anything. You need the color data to be able to do those things.
But that's
so I wouldn't choose that camera myself, but
that's Leica through and through. They basically say it's difficult to use and it forces you to be creative. Discuss. Not now though.
No, not now. If I can.
Going back to Lightroom, have you ever tried playing with the color sliders at the bottom under the where you can choose the which process calibration you use, because they can be quite interesting in color, but I've never used them in black and white.
Yeah, I'm going to be spending a bit of time next week looking at presets and profiles in Lightroom. So would you mind if I park that for today?
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. Anyway, so you can start messing with Lightroom's auto mixer and do your own, make your own decisions. And it's a creative decision. There's no right or wrong. Do you want your reds dark, your reds light, and so on and so forth. The plugin that is most popular, I think, around the world for black and white is called Silver FX Pro. It's part of the Nick collection. It is pretty darn good. I have reservations about it, which I can demonstrate when I play with it next week, but it is pretty darn good. I've just got access to Topaz's black and white conversion, which is now integrated into their studio product. From what I've seen so far, it's actually very similar to Lightroom, but I need to spend another hour or two on it between now and next Monday to say anything more definitive. And Lightroom, not so long ago, introduced what they call profiles, which are not quite the same as presets, because they keep all your history, which is very useful. If you do, as soon as you go into a plugin, you've lost the pre-plugin history. But with Lightroom profiles, you can choose from a number of monochrome profiles and you've still got all your history. So it's got a lot going for it, but again, that's really for next week. Now, controversial. Don't be afraid of extreme settings. I've said when you're looking at a color picture, you can only really push the sliders so far before it loses any sort of grip with reality. In monochrome, you can be much more dramatic. And I hope some of the pictures of my own that I've showed you, whether you happen to like them or not, have shown you the sort of drama that you can bring out of mono. Now, what's controversial about it is I had a conversation with Paul Graber, one of whose pictures I showed you earlier, who's much more into subtlety. And he doesn't like to overcook things. And I think I'm gradually, as I'm growing up and maturing, I may be coming round to dealing with things a little bit more subtly. But I think it's still true to say that you can push things a lot harder in mono than you would in color. Okay, so the bit I can't demonstrate. Printing for me is crucial. I reckon it's the ultimate form of any monochrome image. Nothing like a dark, rich mono print on a good paper. And I'm afraid it's expensive to get it right. Many cheaper printers use a combination of color inks to produce black and white, but it's almost impossible to get rid of a color cast. And for the best results, you do need one of the high quality Epson or Canon photo printers with several dedicated black and gray inks. Or you can use a top commercial printing house. And we see, I think at our club, Ronnie and David could nod, it's about 50-50 people who do their own printing and people who use external houses. And we certainly get great results from some of the commercial houses. Personally, I prefer to be in charge of the whole process from soup to nuts. In other words, from making the photograph to printing it, and if need be, reprinting it. Choosing paper is really important because, slight oversimplification, but basically the paper determines how bright the whites are because there's no ink being laid down, or very little on the whitest bit. The printer inks how dark the blacks are. So gloss, matte and art papers work well for different subjects. And I'm part of this maturing process. I'm moving over to matte papers a lot more because I think they tend to produce really nice results with mono. So why do we still shoot monochrome? We are coming to the end, you're probably pleased to hear. It provides plenty of opportunity for creativity and a different look, emotion and message from a photo. Digital post-processing has, and maybe this is an ironic comment, made it much easier to control results and produce excellent images. You know, what you can achieve now in Lightroom, Photoshop, whatever your poison is, you have an incredible level of control. The best printers can now produce results which emulate closely the work of the finest darkroom workers. Now, somebody on the forum today said they still didn't think digital printing was quite as good as a good old-fashioned film-based print. I don't know if that, I think it was Otto. Is Otto amongst us? No, apparently not. I think it's pretty darn close now. Monochrome remains a core part of the history of photography, yet it retains its validity in the 21st century. And final slide, this is Send Me Your Images, part 2, 7:30 next Monday. If you would like, and I hope some of you will, to send me good, I would prefer images that are colourful rather than ones that are already quite monochromatic, that you think might work in mono. I'd suggest not more than 2 per person because I think we're going to get enough. If it's a JPEG, just email it to the address that's up on the screen there, paul.graber@ntlworld.com. If you're sending RAW files, which is great, I don't really mind either way. WeTransfer is a really easy way to transfer larger files, but if you prefer Dropbox, that's fine too. And then next Monday, I will work through as many as I can using Lightroom, SilverFX, and Topaz. At which point,
Paul,
I shall say, sorry.
Yeah, Paul, I use DxO Film Pack 5. I don't use none of them.
Yeah, I haven't got DxO Film Pack, but I think you end up with pretty much the same set of controls of the individual colours. I won't be able to demonstrate it because I haven't got it, but I don't think the principles are very different.
I've got it, but I have no idea how to use it. So if you want to see what the controls look like, I can share my screen, but I'm not an expert on black and white.
Okay. I honestly think the 3 things I'm going to show, it's not going to be massively different in other bits of software. The basic principle is giving you the control of lightening and darkening individual colours in the monochrome transfer. Ian, I've reached the end, but I'm very happy if people have got any questions to stay on for a bit.
Absolutely. One on printing, if anybody's interested. You're talking about inkjet printers of various qualities, but has anybody used, what do they call it, chromogenic printing, where you take a digital file but print it using chemicals?
I haven't.
Well, no.
Chromogenic printing has been around a very long time. In fact, chromogenic film, XP1 400.
Yeah.
That was a chromogenic black and white film based on the C41 process, which came out in the 80s, I think, or maybe the late 70s. The problem is that I think chromogenic, it's in the name. It's color, and you're making black and white out of color, so it's a bit of a compromise, if you ask me. But that said, some of you were on the chat with Danny Chow a few days ago, and it's a shame that I can't demonstrate to you right now, but some of the prints he's been able to produce using a professional color inkjet printer, properly calibrated, properly set up with the right profile matching the right paper, you would think you were looking at a silver halide black and white print. They are that good. They can be good, but you really do have to set the printer up. You have to have the right batch of inks profiled for the right batch of paper, and you need to know what you're doing. And Danny has produced exhibition prints for some of the top black and white photographers, and they've been very pleased with the results he's achieved. And that's using a color printer. While I'm here, one of the things I used to really enjoy when I was a lot younger in the darkroom, skiving off country runs, I think it was, at school, was printing on Portriga Rapid paper. Do any of you remember darkroom days? Have you ever heard of Portriga Rapid?
Yeah, used to use it at the college.
There you go. Portriga Rapid is a bromide paper, but it's not black. It's not silver halide black. It comes up slightly off black. It's a warm black, and it's the most marvelous paper to use. It was made by Agfa, and I used to love that paper. But obviously it's a mono paper. It wasn't toned. It was black and white, but it was just not quite black. and it was just superb.
That's interesting, Ian. I used to use Agfa in a darkroom years and years ago, and I used their ordinary black and white. I can't remember the name of the paper; it's so long ago.
Brovera.
Who?
Brovera. I think.
Maybe, anyway, I mean, you're talking about the late 60s, early 70s. I used Oikobrom developer for it, and it gave you a lovely blue-black.
Oh, right.
Really was. It was really, really lovely. It was. But that was a long time ago. I can't do that with what I've got now.
Well, with digital, you can, of course. But there you go.
Yes, of course you can, yeah.
Can I just agree with Jim McCabe, about something? I've just looked on chat, which obviously I wasn't able to do while I was talking, and he's getting very good results from an Epson P600. I've actually got the 800, more because I like the bigger size of the ink cartridges than because I actually print A2 very often. But I'm getting pretty good results from that too. But there are the modern Canons are pretty much equally good. There's not a lot to choose between the best of them.
Anybody else?
I think you'll find the old Agfa paper was record rapid, the traditional one.
Yes, that's the fibre-based paper. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Beautiful paper, beautiful paper.
Brovera,
glossy.
Brovera was the resin-coated paper, I think, from memory. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Question from me, Paul, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
Interested to note your comments about the Leica monochrome camera. Are we, do you think, disadvantaged in any way with the fantastic color capabilities of our modern digital equipment for a monochrome environment?
Well, personally, I don't think so. I've read a review of that Leica which suggests that the actual quality of output it produces is superb. But for me, that's less significant than losing the ability to mess with it, to decide how I want my picture to look. So no, I mean, I'm a simple soul, and I would like to. I occasionally think when I take a shot, this is going to end up in mono, but very often I don't make that decision until I'm post-processing it afterwards, and I like that freedom. Maybe, I don't know if it's how far I'd push this analogy. Maybe it's a little bit the same as people who prefer primes and people who prefer zooms.
Yeah.
A prime is limiting you. You've got to work with it. You've got to work within its limitations and what it can do. And that can arguably work well for your photography. I'm for most of the time in the zoom camp. I like the flexibility that offers. As I say, I'm not sure how far I'd push this analogy, but does anyone else? Has anyone actually used it, the Leica monochrome?
Certainly in the Zoom camp now, Paul. Boom, boom.
I have used the monochrome. I've been lucky enough to use them, but only for a short period. The images I brought back were very good, but what frustrated me was that if I didn't like the tonality, unlike with a color original, you can't mess around with it. You're stuck with. You can change the contrast, and that's about it. So if you don't like the tonality, then you can't do a lot with it. I think that one of the main benefits of the Leica monochrome is that you can get amazing detail, and obviously with a color sensor, you're losing quite a lot of very fine detail because of the Bayer array. But when it comes to tonality, and if your picture has enough of its own depth, then I think you're going to get results which you can't achieve with a mono camera, personally.
I'd have to say I'm inclined to agree with that. What caught my attention about this particular session, not that I'm really a big proponent or exponent of black and white photography, is that one of my all-time favorite photos I've ever taken was a badly underexposed shot of the High Commander, not on an Olympus, I would have to say, and the fault was all mine, and it's absolute rubbish as a color shot. But just on a whim, a year or two ago, I threw a Lightroom a cream tone, I think it was, toned preset at it, and converted it to a monochrome, and it's absolutely wonderful. I'm looking at it now. It's absolutely glorious. And in color, it just wouldn't work at all. So I'm inclined to go with the, let's have the full range, the full spectral range, and then we can cherry pick what we need to make the best monochrome image. Yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
I mean, let's not disrespect Leica. Leica photographers like Leica because it challenges them. You're locked into the way Leica do things, absolutely, but it's just a way of doing things in a particular way, and let's not miss sight of the fact that Leicas produce amazing images. It's just that it's not the only way to produce amazing images.
Yeah.
Ian, can I ask a question, please?
Okay.
Does anybody take JPEG and RAW images using the JPEG as the black and white, so when they get it on the computer, it doesn't, the mono element doesn't disappear? Because if you take a RAW in black and white, as soon as you put it on the computer, it goes to color.
Okay.
But if you take the JPEG, it retains the black and white that you took it.
Can I answer that one?
Yeah, go.
I mean, basically, a RAW is it's color anyway. So it really depends on the software that you're using. So it's a raw image is made for color as a starting point. So most software will show a color version of the image, whereas the JPEG that you've produced inside your camera using whatever mono mode, an art mode, whatever, is a development of the color image. So it shouldn't be unusual for the raw image to start off as a color image. I suppose you could apply a profile, which meant that the raw file would be displayed as a starting point in mono, but you'd have to customize that.
You could also use Olympus Workspace, which will adapt the profile that you had in the JPEG and show it to you exactly.
Oh, okay.
I may be wrong, but I have a feeling in the most recent update of Lightroom that they allow you to take the previews from the camera. You have to select it as your option or your default or something like that. I haven't looked into it, but I seem to remember reading somewhere that was the case. And so therefore, if you do that, because the display that you actually get when it first comes up, the preview, is actually just the JPEG from the camera before it converts the RAW, you can actually force it to look at that, to keep with that. Now, really, it's just a method, I think, of them allowing you to look at the previews more quickly. But if it's not going to convert to a preview, it's going to take the JPEG straight out of the camera. It should still be in black and white, I think.
It will be, but how useful is that black and white to you? Because it's back to the Leica argument again, because what you're really going to want to do is play with the color and turn that into a post-process black and white.
Precisely.
Yeah, it doesn't stop you from doing that, because when you actually open up on the full screen, it then converts. So it's only when you've got it on the grid view, I think, that it'll do that. But as I say, I haven't really tried it out, so I'm not 100% certain.
Surely you're throwing a lot of, what do you call it, away on that, don't you? With the raw file, you've got all the detail there.
Detail shouldn't necessarily be lost with a mono conversion from a raw file. In fact, you might even retain more detail because color tends to rob you of detail because of the way the sensor works. The sensor is using 3 pixels to make definition for 1 pixel, unless you've got a sigma, I can't remember the name of the sensor, but that has a, sorry?
Foveon.
Foveon, that's the one.
And isn't it 4 pixels anyway? Aren't there 2 greens, 1 red, 1 blue?
Yes, you're right. Yes, that's correct actually as well. So basically, you lose resolution with color. Obviously, color is still making the pixels in your black and white, but I think that in essence, you retain a little bit more of that detail.
It's not what I've been taught, you see, that the RAW and all the color can give you a far superior black and white than your JPEG.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Sorry, I misunderstood your question. Yes, absolutely. RAW is better, full stop. It's harder work, but a JPEG is simply the camera's decision or whatever, how it was created, is simply one result, whereas RAW is your full toolkit. It's your full latitude, and you have to choose what you're going to do with it.
I shoot, when I'm looking at monochrome, I'll shoot RAW and JPEG. Quite often I'll use dramatic tone filters in the EM1 cameras, and that gives me a good indication of what I can aim for and improve when I put it into Lightroom. And that's at the taking stage. It helps me to see what it's going to look like in black and white.
Yeah.
Very rarely do I take a picture that's in colour, and I have done it, but mostly if I do a picture and I'm looking at it in colour, it'll end up as a colour print. But
yeah,
black and white, that facility in the e-cameras is great, I think.
And that's a great point. A lot of people simply refuse to use art filters, but they have their place, and dramatic tone can be very useful for visualizing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sorry.
Sorry, Paul. I'm just going to make a comment about RAW and black and white. One of the things that I do is working on some historical glass plate negatives. And so I've got, starting with a pure black and white. And the technique I use is to rephotograph them on a light box. And then using the RAW files that I've got from these, I can pull out details that I just can't see, because the camera has picked out that subtlety. So I'm working with a pure black and white image, but then working with that RAW file, I can turn that into something that's very usable. I mean, like I say, I'll probably talk some point future about one of the historical projects we're going to do, work with some early black and whites. But this, yeah, I'm a big proponent of using RAW, even when you are only dealing with black and white.
Good point.
Okay.
Can I just ask Paul? One other question on a different subject? When you mentioned earlier that most competitions, I mean, I'm not a member of a club or anything like that, but they were just looking at defined it as black and white and maybe one color. Would something like that exclude things like split toning and so you using a sort of blue selenium and a warmer tone for the whites and things like that?
Yeah, it would. You can only really do half a split tone. As you can use one of those tones, but not both. There's nothing to stop you doing split toning and entering it into an open competition, but a monochrome competition is no more than one color, and black or white.
Do you mean like colour popping? So I could have a black and white image with a red in it, or I mean, my understanding of monochrome is one colour. Okay, you may have various shades of grey. It's either black or white, and if it's a colour tone or a sepia or a blue tone or whatever. I've not heard of your definition before.
That's correct, David. The PAGB are very, very specific about this. They will no longer allow colour popping. Anything colour popped is a colour picture.
Yeah, and you can't use tritones or duotones either.
Correct.
Yeah, But Graham, I think it's the case that the colour has to be throughout the picture.
Correct.
And not just in a part of it. So you can't colour pop in a mono.
Correct.
Monochrome.
In a monochrome comp. Of course you can colour pop to your heart's content in an open competition, but Ian, do you think it's probably about, I thought we were going to run 40, 45 minutes. Do you think we're reaching the point where we ought to be
going to bed?
Going to bed? Not quite. But...
Well,
quick question.
Go on.
Has anybody played with the Pen F and used the monochrome on that? It's great fun. It really is. Set the monochrome profile up, take JPEGs, also take RAW. And if you've got problems visualizing black and white, which I definitely have, it's a great way of photographing stuff. And I've had a lot of fun with it, with the Pen F. So it's worth playing with.
I'd like to get one.
I have to say that one thing I've learned from this evening is, this idea of visualizing black and white using the camera, and I had never done that. So I have used some of the black and white modes, but not routinely to do visualization. I was just messing around with the camera, so that's something I'll definitely play with. Okay, well let's draw a line there. Thank you very much, Paul, for your time, and please, everyone, let's deluge Paul with images for him to convert. And if you need any help with getting images over to Paul, please contact Paul or myself, and we'll help you. And I expect he'd prefer RAW files, although he did say that JPEGs are okay.
Yeah, I marginally prefer RAW files, but I can demonstrate the techniques on JPEGs. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
May I slip in one last quickie, which is perhaps relevant? What I've noticed over the years, and I've been shooting Olympus since my first E10, beg its pardon. As the years have gone by, the default camera profiles in Lightroom, the JPEGs have become closer and closer and closer to the RAWs in terms of their default appearances. So much so that I always shoot RAW and JPEG, and I always archive the JPEGs as the negative. But in a black and white, in a monochrome environment, is there an advantage in RAW in terms of dynamic range when you're processing or converting to a monochrome image?
Yes.
I think there's exactly the same advantage in dynamic range that you would have with a color image. I think the advantages are pretty much identical, and the ability at either end of the spectrum, the very bright and very dark elements, being able to get more detail out of those. I think that's equally true in mono.
I would say that you can actually fudge more dynamic range or more apparent dynamic range out of mono than color.
I'm inclined to agree. The image I referred to earlier, I couldn't do anything with it at all in a normal RGB color space whatsoever. But as a monochrome, it's a stunner. Well, I'm biased, of course, because it's a high commander.
You're going to have to post it.
She wouldn't thank me, I don't think. I may seek permission.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Paul.
You can have your evenings back now. And I hope you'll join us again this time next Monday. And I do promise the whole process of getting the connection codes will be simpler. And we won't have this messing around at the beginning, which I apologize for. Okay, so thank you.
And I did get there eventually.
Yes, I do apologize, but thank you. Thank you, Paul. And I think it's been a great success. We had 50 people on this evening, and that's just amazing. So I'm delighted, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thank you, Paul. Very good.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Take care, all.
Bye.